Welcome everyone to this edition of Growing Up in Science. I'm glad you can join us today. For those of you who are attending their first Growing Up in Science, I'll just tell you a little bit of background, give you a little bit of background. My name is Wei Jima. I'm a professor in neuroscience and psychology at New York University. And I started the Growing Up in Science series 7 years ago to highlight the human stories behind academic scientists. And they these events have features people's life stories with an emphasis on struggles, difficult failures, detours, doubts. So we've highlighted a lot of speakers from a wide range of backgrounds over the years, and in recent years we've also made more efforts to give voice to underrepresented groups in academia. So we are really excited today to have Dr. Cindy Joyce as our guest, and she will be introduced later by Sean. But one characteristic of Cindy is that she's a member of the Minceir. I hope I am pronouncing that correctly, an ethnic nomadic group in Ireland that, to my embarrassment, I have to say I had not heard of before Sean brought Sydney's accomplishments to my attention. So we're going to be hearing from Cindy today. This event is in collaboration with Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. We have Miriam Nayan here as their representative. And a more complete introduction is going to be provided by Sean, Sean Froudist-Walsh, who was the initiator of this event. He's a postdoc in neuroscience at NYU, and he will do the further introductions. Sean, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Weiji. Weiji's, been a wonderful figure for us, kind of coming up in academia in terms of people who can both excel academically, but also in terms of pushing forward and fighting for people in terms of representation and rights. And I'm really delighted that I'm actually surrounded, at least on screen, by people that are in the same category. Here, co-sponsoring the event or co-presenting the event with the Growing Up in Science today is the NYU Glucksman Ireland House, and in particular, Dr. Miriam Nayan-Gray, who's one of the directors, I think the director of graduate studies at the NYU Glucksman House. Her work focuses on the intersections of migration, race, and ethnicity. She's well known in the Irish American community. She's the presenter of This Irish American Life radio show. She's a prominent voice highlighting the diversity in the Irish diaspora in America and elsewhere. And she's been an excellent presenter and organizer of some really wonderful events in the last year or two here at NYU. So, Dr. Nayan-Gray.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you, Weiji, again for inviting us to co-sponsor this event. And it's such an honor to share a screen and space with Dr. Cindy Joyce. I'm really looking forward, as a female academic myself, I'm looking forward to hearing from her herself in this wonderfully conceived series about, I would say, I guess, nicely put, the challenges or the journeys that have had to be made in terms of her massive accomplishments. As Sean mentioned, I'm based at the Centre for Irish Studies at NYU. If you don't already know about us, please put NYU Irish Studies or Glucksman Ireland House into your search engine and find out more. And as Sean mentioned, at the moment, one of our major research initiatives and documentation strategies is the Black, Brown and Green Voices series, in which we are really proactively trying to collect for the Archives of Irish America and amplify the voices of members of our community that have heretofore been overlooked. So thank you for your support in that vein, and thank you again again for bringing Dr. Joyce into this space in the spirit of what we're doing at Glucksman Ireland House. And I look forward to the panel. I'll hand back to you, Sean. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Miriam. And so YG just asked me to say a couple of words about how I kind of became interested and heard about Dr. Joyce's work and became interested in the issues of the Minceir. And I suppose for me personally, it probably started when I moved as a teenager to Ballyferma in West Dublin, which has a big Minceir population. And me and my family, we got to meet several Minceir, including the great Irish musician Finbar Fury and his son Rob. And really, Minceir have excelled in all aspects of Irish culture and indeed British culture. But they have to face serious discrimination at home. And I went on then, I moved into the field of neuroscience and mental health, and I learned about the links between racism, segregation, and mental health. And I wanted to learn more about the situation for the Minceir in Ireland in particular. And what I found was really quite, even though I already knew it was bad, it was really quite shocking. According to one survey, 75% of Irish people said they would not like to live next door to Minceir people. And unsurprisingly, this type of discrimination has lots of consequences on mental health. And about 11% of Minceir commit suicide, which is a rate 7 times higher than the general population. And another figure that I read recently is that about 50% of Minceir people don't actually live past the age of 38 years old, which is really shocking in a rich country like Ireland, I think. So when I was looking up this information, the work of one academic kept popping up, and I'm delighted to say it's our guest today. Dr. Cindy Joyce has won several awards, including the Traveller Pride Award for Education, the IRC Government of Ireland Postgraduate Scholarship. She was named one of 50 brilliant Irish women by the Daily Edge in 2018. In that same year, she became the first Minceir to be awarded a PhD in Ireland. She was also appointed to the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins Council of State. But more than just being an academic, she's a prominent voice and a human rights defender for discriminated peoples within Ireland and around the world. And she achieves all of this as a proud Minceir woman and a role model for many. So I'm delighted that we're going to get to hear her story today. And thanks, and join me in welcoming Dr. Cindy Joyce.
I have a brief logistical comment. So we take question and answers through the Q&A. So if you have questions for Cindy, please post them there. You can upvote questions by others. And also something fun that we typically do in our Growing Up Science events is that you briefly introduce yourselves in the chat so that we have a bit of an idea of our audience. And that's all.
So I just got some already feedback from, I think it's Francie Scanlon, or maybe Frankie, Francie, I guess. So I'm going to speak a bit louder. And so Dr. Joyce, if you'd just like to start by maybe telling us a bit about your life, maybe your early life as a Minceir person growing up in Ireland, and your experience there, and how maybe it might be different from other Irish people growing up, or similar, and maybe your first experiences in school and so on.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted here to be able to come here today and speak to you all. Yeah, so I suppose I'll begin. I suppose I wasn't actually born in Ireland. My parents are what would be known as Irish travellers, who and as a nomadic community travelled between both Britain and Ireland. So I spent my younger years travelling on the roadsides of England and Wales, particularly, and then coming home to Ireland and travelling for a little bit and settling down then, I suppose, in Limerick. And Yeah, so I suppose I was born in Wales and travelling on the roadside. So my early years in school really were on an ad hoc basis because of being nomadic. It was we were kind of always literally on the move. So so yeah, so my early years then it kind of began like that. My reading and writing and stuff, a lot of that will be done from the caravan, sitting at home in the caravan, reading newspapers with my father, reading about the political things that were happening in society at the time, you know. So I suppose a lot of the times I would always say that, you know, I suppose there can be a difference with mainstream education and education that is done I suppose at home as well, you know. So I suppose with my reading and writing, while other children were reading Goldilocks and Three Little Bears and all the Red Riding Hood and all the children's books and stuff, I didn't really have much of that growing up. It was more the newspapers that I had. So I suppose that kind of brought me to have an open mind at a young age, to have a mind to look at what was happening in the world, I suppose. And I suppose it also kind of gave me that strength, I suppose, to question and analyse things that are happening in a critical manner. But also, I suppose then when I moved home to Ireland, we, because my father and my grandfather would be from Limerick, so we moved to Limerick at home to my father's hometown, and I was living. We were living in a caravan for 2 years before we moved into a house, and we were living on what would be called, I suppose, an unofficial site. So there was no services like water or electricity or toilets, and we were there for a couple of years, to maybe 2.5 to 3 years, maybe around that time before we moved into the house. And I suppose when I moved into secondary school, you know, I suppose that was a time that I began to kind of question. I suppose like all teenagers, you know, you kind of question who you are and your identity, and kind of like. You want to know things about yourself and kind of express yourself and all that. But I suppose going to school in secondary school, there were times where there were discrimination, but there were times then that were good times in education as well. But if you look at the history of education with the Minceir, the Irish traveller community, and you look at the segregation that was experienced going back decades, and you look at that trauma coming from that generational trauma that goes on to the next generation, you know. So and I suppose the everyday experiences of racism in Ireland as well, the impact of that outside of school would impact you, your schoolwork and yourself, I suppose, within school itself, you know. So that was quite difficult, you know. There was times like what's really common here in Ireland would be that when you walk into shops, you would be followed around, for example, because of they have the negative media and negative stereotypes, and they have the negative stereotype of us having high rates of criminality. And if you look at kind of the prison statistics here in Ireland, and you can see like that, if you look at the Minceir women in prison, you know, Minceir women are 20 times more likely to end up in prison than Irish settled woman, you know. And just there last year, the United Nations actually commented on that and talked about how the community is being ethnically profiled in the prison system and in the justice system in general. And you can see then when you even look back at the Irish police force on Froudist-Walsh here in Ireland, and you look at, they did their own study, internalized study, research themselves on attitudes, where they ranked ethnic minorities and ethnic communities, where they ranked them on kind of their experiences and their attitude towards them. But within their study, they found that not one frontline Garda member that answered to the surveys had any positive attitude towards our community. And so when you look at those experiences, but also I suppose when you look at in general Irish society in general, the racism and discrimination is so embedded into Irish society that it's become so normalised and a common experience that people don't even see it as racism or think that it's racism. You know, it tends to come back to, I suppose, blaming us as a community that we won't assimilate or become part of the settled community. You know, like when you look back, the first government report, for example, in Ireland in 1963 towards us, the community, you can see the then Taoiseach, former Taoiseach, Mr. Charles Haughey, you know, he stated within that report that, and when you bear in mind in 1963, less than 20 years after the Holocaust, Charlie Haughey used the words, "There can be no final solution until itinerants," as we were called at that time, are absorbed into the general community. So that type of language was just accepted and continued on into policies and, I suppose, the trespassing of our nomadic lifestyles as well. You know, in 2002, where the anti-trespass law was brought in, so we can be fined €2,000 or end up in prison for being nomadic in Ireland at the moment. And you can see, I suppose, if you're looking at internationally, you can see at the moment with England, they're trying to bring in the same law that Ireland brought in 2002. So they're trying to criminalise the nomadic lifestyles of the travelling communities within England. So when you look at, I suppose, all that involved, but also, I suppose, when you look at coming from, I suppose, as a child, you don't see any of that. You know, as a child, your parents protect you from a lot of the racism and discrimination that happens, you know, and, you know, you coming from a loving and caring family and community, and then you go out into the outside world and you see the coin flipped, so to speak, where you're seen to be hated in society, where you're seen to be not good enough or inferior because you have a different culture and identity than the dominant settled population in Ireland. So when you look at that and you see how that has been embedded into society itself, you can see that it came from, I suppose, the top government, you know, when they started to criminalise our lifestyle. You know, we're an Indigenous ethnic community that hasn't been recognised for that until 2017, when there was a statement made in the Dáil about it. But before that, it was a denial of our ethnicity, a denial of who we are, trying to say that we're just a broken people that need to be fixed into society. And you know, that denial brings kind of the emotional and mental health issues within the community as well. Sean, you were talking about the suicide rates within the community. The suicide rate is 7 times higher for men in the community, and it's 5 times higher for the women in the community. And I suppose a lot of that is to do with the racism and discrimination, the exclusion, the marginalisation, you know, all of that, where a lot of the community, like if you look at, just for an example, County Clare at the moment, you know, over nearly half of the Minceir population in Clare at the moment, during the pandemic, have no access to running water, you know. So when you look at those issues and how that can be justified within the county councils, for example. You know, they're giving out about they were giving out about the removal of boulders. Like if you know Ireland, you know the countryside, you have that view of the boulders that has been put all over Ireland, and that was with response to the Trespass Act, and it was to block caravans and trailers from parking up in those areas. And only last week, the county council were discussing removing some boulders in an area, and one of the councillors stated that they would rather see the boulders than seeing caravans coming in, and started to talk about illegal encampments and, you know, bringing in all this, I suppose, the anti-nomadic attitudes and anti-Minceir attitudes that are, I suppose, making decisions on the community's life that is putting the community in health at risk, everyday risk. And I suppose you can see that with, I suppose, with all the issues that the community are facing within those accommodation issues. But if you, I suppose, if you look at how Irish society responds to that, is an issue that we need to kind of sort out in Ireland, because the response isn't outrage. It isn't, how can this be happening in one of the richest countries in the world to a group of people? It's just become so normalised that it's shoved off or shoved under the carpet, you know. So yeah, I suppose so. Growing up, I suppose, with that attitude outside of my loving home, I suppose, where I have my family and my friends, I suppose was difficult. And I suppose going through education, a lot of the times it was kind of difficult as I got older, and given the fact that when you look at the education rates within my community, you know, only 13% of my community finished secondary school level education. So when you look at that, by the time that I got to my junior cert, coming up mid exam year, you know, I was one of the few Minceir students that was left in the class. And then by the time I got to leaving cert, I was the only Minceir student left in the class. So that can be lonely as well, that would affect.
So I might just interject just for maybe some of the people not familiar with the Irish system. I guess that would be the equivalent of finishing high school over here, right? And Dr. Joyce was the last Minceir person left in her class already by that stage. So, sorry, please continue.
Yeah. So yeah, that was quite difficult, but. I suppose I was always, within school, I was always interested in school. I was always, I was one of those students that had my homework done most of the time. You know, I was, I suppose, I wanted to do my education, but there were times there that I would have left school if I was allowed to have leave school, but my parents were kind of strict on that we stay at school. And I suppose when I left secondary school and finished my leaving cert, I didn't even think about going to university, because it just wasn't, it was just so far away from me. You know, mentally, it wasn't a thing that a lot of my community did. And I suppose that goes back to the history of the segregation in the education system. And I suppose when I entered college, then I went into the University of Limerick and I did my degree. And I went back then and I did my master's and my PhD, and gone the whole way.
So what made you actually decide to take this unusual step, I suppose, and brave step to go to university? What was it that kind of drove you?
It was a mixture of different things. To be honest, you know, it was a time, I suppose, that I was I had finished school. You know, I had met my boyfriend, and we were looking to kind of see like what we're going to do with our lives, and at that stage, like so and I suppose at the time I had worked in different employment, like precarious work, a lot of precarious work. I did a lot of waitressing, I worked in a bakery, I worked in a bar, different things like that. And, it just wasn't something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It didn't really, I didn't feel happy doing that type of work, I suppose, but also there was discrimination as well in the workplaces where I worked, for example, in the bar that I worked in, a customer came in and said to the manager, because I was from the Minceir community, that how can you trust me with working the till? And within 2 days later, I was let go from my job because of that. And these experiences, I suppose, of discrimination that are blatant discrimination, but so open that it's so, I suppose, closed. It would be, in a sense, what I mean is that people are just so open in their racism that they say, no, it's not racism, or, it's not because of this, but the language that's used, and I suppose at that time then I began to look at different jobs, looking at kind of like my career opportunities, what was there for me, and both myself and my partner, we decided then to go to college together in the University of Limerick. So yeah, I went in then, and my bachelor's degree was actually in English and history, and I suppose when I started my degree, it was so different for me, I suppose. The university looked so, I suppose, imposing for someone like me. I suppose, I wasn't used to like what we would say about the University of Limerick, the pearly white gates, I suppose. It looked like something that was just so far away for people like me. So that was kind of difficult. But what also was difficult, I suppose, was because I was living in the city, in Limerick City at the time, and travelling on the city bus to the University of Limerick every day. You would hear conversations, but also you would hear conversations on campus as well, amongst students talking about my community, using derogatory terms about my community. Calling us the K word, which is a derogatory term. That would just be a continuous slur that would be used, and I would openly hear it, and that was difficult of how to, I suppose, challenge that, being in a space that was so, I suppose, at the time different, and I suppose at times lonely, and I suppose that was quite hard. But then I suppose the more that I went on in university, and the more that I learned about myself and my identity and my community and the history of my community and what had happened to us as a community, the persecution that had happened to us, it kind of put me more in a human rights stance, in that I went back and I did my master's in sociology, and then continued on and did my PhD.
Excellent. So it's really interesting that you kind of mentioned that you went back and had to learn about your own history and the history of the Minceir people. Now, was that kind of easy for you in school or college, where university, where you studied history, or is it something that you had to kind of search out yourself?
I suppose one of the things that we as a community are fighting for at the moment is for the Irish education system to bring in our culture and our history onto the curriculum. It's not on the curriculum, so people don't learn about us as a community through education. They learn about us through the negative media and stereotypes that are portrayed, and from the person down the street that might have had a bad experience, you know, and that's how it becomes embedded into society then, is because they're not learning the history of the community and the culture, and the beauty of the history and the culture, and our contribution to Irish society in general, you know, and that is not on the curriculum, so I didn't learn any of that within the school system. I suppose when I was doing my history degree, I had one lecturer, and he came from the background of Minceir community himself, and he was teaching. So he made sure to bring in the history of the community in that. So that was kind of, I suppose, the beginning of me, I suppose, learning about the history and of our community and the culture of it. So yeah, but there wasn't anything else, even in the university courses. That was the only thing that was there, and I think that has finished at the moment. So I don't think that there's any university in Ireland at the moment that has a module on the Traveller community, the culture and identity, the ethnicity. You know, so we have been, I suppose, even in history books, like the Irish history books written about Irish history, we have been neglected from Irish history. We haven't been included whatsoever in any of the history, you know, so we have been totally isolated from the history of Ireland. So when you look at kind of like all the I suppose the issues that Ireland faced as a society, it was as if that we didn't even exist within those educational packs and history books and things like that. So that's, I suppose, the difficulty of it within Ireland, is for people trying to get information about the community, the correct information, because there was a time, particularly I suppose around the 90s, the early 90s, that a lot of academics kind of researched us. You know, we were one of probably over-researched community, and a lot of it was done from a settled perspective, and without the knowledge or the awareness of the culture and identity, but also you know, that brought on false myths, I suppose, and stereotypes into the writing. You know, so a lot of that has to be corrected as well. Like, a lot of it is being corrected, and that's one of the good things at the moment where we are in our society, is that it's a time now that we can begin to look at what has been put out there, and the information that has been put out there that is wrong, and correct that from our own perspectives and our own history and culture, where we can celebrate who we are as a people. But not only as an Indigenous ethnic group of Ireland, but also as Irish people as a whole, that we can celebrate our identity and our culture within the Irish society without any of that negative stereotypes being attached to it, or without any fear of, I suppose, without any fear for us of being able to celebrate that identity. You know, when you look at I suppose when you look at the employment rates within my community, like Sean, that survey that you mentioned at the beginning, within that survey, you know, 75% of the people answered that they wouldn't have a Minceir as a co-worker. You know, so when you look at that, and you look at kind of like the survey, employers were included as well, and 83% of employers said they would not employ a member of my community. You know, and that just it reflects the unemployment rates within my community as well, where our unemployment rates is over 80%. You know, so when you look at that, there should be outrage in Irish society when this is happening on people's doorstep, but there just seems to be ignorance of that, and just it just doesn't seem to affect people at all, you know. So I I suppose one of the things that, that I suppose what would be good about the education of our culture and our history being brought into onto the curriculum would be that from a very young age, not only children from our own community, but all children would learn about different cultures and ethnicity, and learn that it's okay to celebrate different, and that difference is actually beautiful.
Yeah, brilliant. Sounds extremely important. And please let us know how we can support that campaign. Perhaps at the end we can share some links to some information where we can do that. So did this kind of motivate you to go on and choose your subject and your PhD?
Yes, it did, because I suppose before I went back and did my master's, I was working in Galway, and I was working with the Galway Traveller Movement, and I suppose I was a coordinator of an after-school project where I was working with the young people of my community. So I suppose there was a time there for a few years that I was kind of surrounded every day with young people, and I suppose their experiences, more than my own experiences, kind of pushed me to, I suppose, document their experiences of racism that they were experiencing at that time. And I suppose because I was living in Galway and I wanted to do Galway, but Galway had a high percentage of Minceir living around the city centre and also in the county. But the children there and the youth, yeah, I wanted to do my research around them. So I did my research on their experiences of racism in the city. But I also wanted to look at the interculturalism within the city, because Galway would be one of Ireland's most multi-ethnic and multicultural cities in Ireland. You know, it's known for that bohemian feel and that friendliness, and you know, all different ethnicities and cultures being expressed. And I wanted to see how the young people from my community felt, how they were experiencing that city, and did they feel that they were included within all that, and what were their everyday experiences.
It's fantastic. And like earlier, you talked about how in the 90s there was a lot of researchers on Minceir, but from the viewpoint of the settled population. I mean, do you think it would have been possible to do your PhD research, you know, if it wasn't from the point of view of a Minceir person? I mean, I imagine that adds a lot in terms of being able to properly engage with the community.
Yeah, I suppose it was easier for me, to gain access to my participants, because being from the same community, you know, but also I suppose being from the culture and I suppose knowing the experiences, like a lot of the experiences that the youth talked about, I had experienced myself when I was their age and younger. You know, experiences like being followed around the shops, for example, experiences of being not allowed into shops, not allowed into casinos, not allowed into cafes, you know, being stopped from using a handball alley, for example, a football pitch, and being bullied within school, you know, being called names on the street, being stopped by the Gardaí for no reason, you know, all these experiences, being followed around shopping centres by security guards, and being talked down to as well, you know. So all these experiences, some of these experiences that the young people had experienced, I had experienced as well, so I could make that connection with them, I suppose. But also there was, because of being an insider researcher, I suppose there was a lot of the nuances that I picked up on that, and on a non-Minceir might not have picked up on, and I suppose even kind of the meanings around different cultural aspects of things within the community, that non-Minceir might not understand, or it might not even, I suppose they mightn't even think of that something might be important, but it might be crucial, it might just go over their head, and it's because of not having, I suppose, that knowledge of the community and the culture itself. And yeah, so I suppose when I was talking about the research there in the 90s, like, I suppose in particular, there's one person's research that stands out, and within their research, they initially they denied our ethnicity, within the research, and what tends to happen then is when you have these non-Minceir researchers that are researching the community without any knowledge, and also, I suppose, going in with those stereotypes without any communication as well, I suppose, with the wider community, it can be quite difficult, because the community, when they trust a researcher, and when the researcher leaves and then there's a negative impact on the community, that trust is broken within society. And I suppose for a trust that's already weakened, it can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and this is a kind of an issue that has been coming up in medical research and health research as well in the US, with communities that have received discrimination. So I think it's a really important point. I might just take one or two of the questions that are coming in from people, mostly I think in America and Ireland, from the comments. There's a comment here from Kathleen Walker. She says, how are Minceir people identified? She's sad to hear of Dr. Joyce's struggle, but good for her, she made it. Sad discrimination, no matter who the target is. And I think this is maybe an interesting question, in that in America, a lot of minority groups can be distinguished maybe because of the color of their skin or other kind of visual features. Whereas I've heard different Minceir, even prominent ones like Tyson Fury, talk about they feel the need sometimes to kind of hide their ethnicity in certain situations. So maybe if you want to answer Kathleen Walker's question about how the Minceir people are identified, I guess, by the non-Minceir people, and also maybe touch on if you or others that you know have ever felt the need to hide your ethnicity.
Yeah, that's kind of a question, I suppose, that a lot of people outside of Ireland would ask, because they would say, like, you're white, you're not there's nothing really there to identify you with. But if you're living in Ireland and you're from Ireland, you know how small of a country it is, and how connected, I suppose, that the population is, and also, I suppose, when you look at, the first visual identification would be for those Minceir that are living on halting sites, for example, and living in trailers and living on road sites. But also, I suppose, the fact of your accent can do it. I suppose because I've been through the education system right to the end, my accent has kind of changed along the ways. But I suppose, but there still are times that I can be identified from my accent when I fall into it. And I suppose some people also say it can be dress, it can be those kind of nuances of, like when I did my research with the young Minceir in Galway, they talked about that one of their tactics to get into a cafe or premises without being discriminated against would be to separate into smaller groups, because it would be easier to identify them as Minceir when they're in groups. And you know, it's quite harming for the mental health of young people to hide their identity and ethnicity, and to have that fear of being outed within the community as well. You know, within school, for example, you know, some children can find it difficult, and they don't, they hide their ethnicity and hide their identity in the fear of their classmates discriminating against them or saying something untoward towards them. And I suppose the fact of a lot of people here in Ireland, as I said, because it's a small country, a lot of our community have they go by the surnames or of people and identify them then with the community. So, so my name Joyce, for example, there would be a big population of Minceir named Joyce, you know, so people would kind of identify it with a Minceir name depending on what part of the country you were from, because you can also then go to Galway, where there's a big population of Joyces who are non-Minceir, you know, so it depends on geographical location as well, where you are and where the community, the Minceir community, I suppose, are living.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I guess it's a multifaceted thing that maybe is well known for people in Ireland, but not quite so easy to or obvious for people outside of Ireland. So thanks for addressing that, and also the, I guess, really difficult situation, like in terms of Minceir feeling that they have to come out or else alternatively hide it. It's just something that a lot of us, I guess, don't even have to consider in our lives. So I've got a question here from Mark Kavanagh. Could Cindy discuss how the travelling community continues to be portrayed in modern Irish culture and media? In particular, it seems that the levels of stereotyping and discrimination of many minority groups have reduced or improved in recent years, but this doesn't seem as evident for the travelling community. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think this may be the case?
Yeah, I suppose if you look at media in general, I suppose you look at mainstream media have got, I suppose, are getting better at portraying, you know, the community. But you look at, I suppose, the biggest thing at the moment, I suppose, would be the social media. You know, how we are portrayed across social media platforms. But also, I suppose, if you look at kind of the exclusion of Minceir from the media itself is a problem. You know, if you look at the mainstream RTE, for example, you have no Minceir presenters across the channels, you know. So if you look at that, if you look at the mainstream media and print, you know, very rarely you will have Minceir write an opinion article in one of the newspapers, you know. So there's no, I suppose, representation in the media for us, you know. So when you're looking at that, and you're looking at how embedded the racism and discrimination is, and how normalised it is in Irish society, that's still continuing on, and it's going on to social media. The hate speech that we experience on social media is just ridiculous, you know. And when you look at Ireland, you see that we're one of the few countries in Europe at the moment that have no hate speech legislation, you know. So people are allowed to get away with saying this horrendous stuff online about people, you know, not only about Minceir, but about other communities, ethnic communities in Ireland at the moment that are also experiencing discrimination. hate speech on social media platforms. And I suppose when you're looking at the social media platforms, they can be, I suppose, they can be very slow on removing these horrendous posts about people, you know, particularly when it comes to the Minceir community, because I'm not sure whether they understand the discrimination and racism, because they can come back with it does not violate our community standards, when you know that it clearly does violate community standards. So whether it's the computer that are censoring these out, or whether it's a person behind the screen that are censoring these out, I don't know. But when you look at that, it seems to be it's more tolerated for us. The hate speech is more tolerated against us on social media. But not also that, I suppose, but when you look at I suppose, because a lot of social media, they can be anonymous people that are just keyboard warriors as well behind their screens, just typing off nonsense, you know, and you understand that. But there's also, I suppose, when you look at, I suppose that they're allowed to get away with that, and because they see, I suppose, the history of people getting away with that in Irish society, being allowed to happen. You know, when you look at the discrimination cases, like for example, there a few years ago, not so long ago, you know, you had a case that came up in court in Kerry, and what that was that somebody had set up a Facebook page, and the Facebook page was knacker babies. Knacker is the derogatory term. Knacker babies for shark bait, you know, and you had nothing but hate speech on that, and that was brought to court, and the judge deemed that that it wasn't discrimination, so it was, you know, just let go. And when you look at that type of thing, that it's allowed to happen in Irish society, you know, you say, how can people justify allowing that to happen? But also, I suppose that was a few years ago, and just there last week, there was another case here in Ireland where there was a black footballer that experienced hate speech online by a young lad in Kerry, and he got let off on court as well on that. So there's no consequences for people that sprout their hatred against a people or a community here in Ireland. And that's one of the huge issues that needs to be rectified, because I suppose when you're looking at that, you're looking at not only, I suppose, these ordinary people that are behind their screens, but you've also, as I stated earlier on, you also have people in powerful decision-making positions that also have these attitudes, and that are saying things within online as well, but also within meetings, and, you know, at home with their families and their friends, and it's spreading the hate from one person to the next. And I suppose that's how it begins to, it's kind of like propaganda that just goes into people's head, you know, that somehow we need to be vilified as a community and society, and that the hate speech and discrimination is somehow justified.
I've been a lot of really powerful and horrendous stories there, Cindy, and you highlighted how kind of modern technology and social media in many ways can make a lot of the discrimination worse. There was a question by Anna McCarthy saying that she's been really impressed by the way Minceir video activists have used phone cameras to document discrimination in restaurants, pubs, etc. So I suppose maybe that might be a way in which technology is also being used to fight back against discrimination.
Yeah, I suppose that's one thing, like with social media, you know, it's two sides, you know. One side is great and the other side is not so good, you know. And I suppose one of the great things about it for our community is to be able to show our side things, you know, of how we are living in Irish society, but also how the experiences of discrimination and racism can be documented for people to see themselves that is happening. But also, I suppose, what social media has done is also it has brought out a lot of, I suppose, the younger people becoming more active within the community, I suppose. You know, you've a lot of younger activists coming up, and I suppose their resilience and their fight for human rights comes across through that. And I suppose what's a good thing as well is that when you have our own community on these social media platforms, that we can dispel those myths there for people to look at, you know, but also to be able to fight for our human rights, for basic human rights that every human deserves. You know, we can highlight, for example, we can highlight a county council not giving part of the community toilets or electricity or sanitation. You know, we can highlight that on social media. And I suppose that's probably one of the good things about it, and documenting those experiences. So yeah, I suppose that's really the good side of social media. But I suppose one of the downsides to it then is that you have a lot of younger people on there as well, looking at the everyday racism and the hateful comments that can impact them mentally, you know. And I suppose one of the things is for there to be for more safety to be there, and that's where it comes down to the platforms themselves, like Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and all, where they immediately take down hateful comments instead of allowing them to go ahead and spread.
I mean, I guess there's a really a list of things then that really we can all kind of contribute to and try to kind of maybe call out this hate speech, but also promote the voices of those people who are brave enough to step up. And I just wanted to maybe ask you if you wanted to say a few words. I think we're going to go on for maybe another 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But if you wanted to say a little bit about your journey from academia and also starting to really focus on human rights. Like, I know that you're part of a frontline defenders organization and a human rights defender, and you've also been named a member of the Council of State for the President of Ireland. So maybe you want to take a few words maybe about what inspires you to really stand up and speak, but also how has your kind of journey into these more prominent human rights positions been?
I suppose throughout my master's and my PhD, I suppose particularly midway through my PhD, which is a difficult time to start, I suppose, reaching out more, I suppose, but I suppose it was all part of to do with while I was in the field work, I suppose, of my PhD stage, you know, where I was meeting a lot more of my community, both younger and older, you know, learning more, I suppose, looking into more kind of, I suppose, the experiences of the community going back and kind of the intergenerational trauma and kind of looking at that, but also, I suppose, looking at, I suppose, researching other research for my research, you know, other research coming from other communities that had also experienced racism and discrimination, you know, so I looked at a lot of research coming from Indigenous communities, coming from the African American communities, you know, I looked at kind of the Roma community, you know, how they experience racism. So just looking at, I suppose, how others experience racism and discrimination, and just the similarities and the connections that I had with that with that research kind of put me kind of more on a broad basis, I suppose, of human rights, you know, for all, you know, and I suppose the strength of coming together, different communities coming together to fight for the same cause. would have been one of the things that kind of pushed me in that direction. And yeah, I suppose I began to be more vocal about racism in our society. Probably a thorn in the side for some people, but has to be done. And yeah, I suppose I just began to have more confidence, I suppose, in being able to be vocal, because I, after researching it, I knew what I was talking about. I knew the research around it and the statistics, and I didn't have that fear of messing up and saying something that could be totally wrong, or so I suppose having that confidence in being able to know my own stuff, and then to be able to broaden that out into other discussions and research, So I suppose yeah. So I began to I began to get a lot of kind of emails and phone calls, and from different people to speak at different events, and at the beginning, it was kind of it was good for me, I suppose, in a sense that it built up my confidence, but also there was another side of it then, that after a while I felt that I don't want to kind of be this token either, this tokenism being used, so I began to kind of be more independent, and learned how to say no to things. And I suppose that's one of the most important things for me, I suppose, is because there was a time that I tried to do too much, and I suppose just learning to be able to analyse the best possible paths, not only for me as an individual, but for my community itself, and for our society in whole, so what's best for my community and what's best for our society. So I suppose that kind of put me in a sense then of fighting for human rights, but also I suppose becoming, I suppose, member of Council of State was one of the surprising things, and it just came like, just got a phone call one day out of the blue to ask me would I be interested, and that was basically it, So that was really exciting, but it was also kind of an achievement for myself as an individual, but also because it was coming off the back of my PhD and the back of my research. It was also, I suppose, it showed me that that my research was something that needed to be done. It was research on the Minceir community by a Minceir, and from a Minceir's perspective, and also from young people's perspective and their everyday experiences. So I suppose that was important to push, I suppose, their agenda of becoming, I suppose, being able to be treated as equals in Irish society.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important, and I'm glad to see that your research is getting the recognition it deserves, and thankfully I think we have a president in Ireland who respects academia and the arts, actually, and you've certainly become an inspiration, I think, to people around Ireland, and I'm sure in the Minceir community. And there's actually a question here from Jack Walsh, the actor, who's also my father, who says, "Hi Cindy, wonderful talk. Has your academic journey been perceived as an inspiration for others within the Minceir community?"
Yeah, I hope so. I suppose the importance about representation is that members of my community, they can see somebody up there from their own community in a position, and know that they can do it too. So I suppose that's something that I didn't have as a young person, was someone up there in the Minceir community that is in a position, So I suppose one of the things that is beginning to change is that you are seeing more makers in higher positions in Irish society. If you look across the board, we have academics and musicians and writers and
senators.
Sorry?
Senators.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have all these magnificent people in our community that are I suppose, paving the way for the younger generation. But I suppose not only that, I suppose my own journey, I suppose, even though I didn't have Minceir up there in a position, what I did have was many Minceir women that came before me that stood up without the education, I suppose, that stood up fighting for human rights for my community, and that paved the way for women academics in my community. And the women there that stood up in the 70s and the 80s, when there was a lot of evictions happening, and so I suppose without having that representation of having somebody to look up to, it can be quite difficult. So I would hope that a lot of the younger people, when they look at me, I would hope that they would see somebody that is from their community and that is up there, that they can do it as well, if that's what they want.
Definitely. Well, I mean, just judging by the comments here and also what I see on social media, it certainly seems that you're already an inspiration to many. So I have a question here. Hi, Dr. Joyce. Thank you for sharing your story. As a Black woman graduate student, I relate very strongly. I wanted to ask you, in your experience in academia, do you ever feel like people question you and your authority or expertise more so than they do your non-Minceir counterparts? How do you respond to this? And that's from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes you feel like that. You feel like that people don't take you serious. They don't take you serious in a way because you're from an ethnic community, or and it's this. I suppose it's the embeddedness of the discrimination that's in society in general, and that can be very clearly in academia as well, and I suppose it is quite difficult because sometimes not only, I suppose, coming from an ethnic minority, but also for a woman as well, we seem to get questioned a lot more, that I suppose one of the things within our community, we always say that we need to work 10 times harder than the ordinary settled Irish person in Ireland. But I suppose when it comes to, and you put a woman on top of that, it would be 20 times harder that we would have to work in order to get our voice out there and to be taken seriously. And I suppose one of the things I find as well, I'm not sure if you kind of relate to this experience as well, is one of the things that I find is that you seem to be called on things as an emergency, for if an event happened or an issue happened within society, and the radio or the newspaper might want to comment from you, but outside of that, they don't really want to contact you in relation to something around your research, for example, and I suppose one of the things is as well is that when you do talk, like I had an experience where I was asked to do a radio show just after completing my PhD, and the radio show was supposed to talk about my research, what my research was about and the conclusions of my research. However, there was hardly no questions about my research. It was all questions on the stereotypes, around criminality within my community, and it went back into those negative stereotypes. So you feel like that your research is not getting the recognition that it deserves because of coming from the community that you come from, and that can be quite difficult. But I think one of the important things that I do is just to keep persevering with your knowledge and your truth, and get your knowledge and truth out there as much as possible.
Excellent advice. So we'll try to squeeze in a last question or two if possible from another anonymous attendee. I'm wondering if Cindy has noticed any changes in majority attitudes towards the Minceir community with recent mainstream trends of anti-racism across the West, as well as spokespersons such as herself and Senator Eileen Flynn, bringing important public discussions into the spotlight.
Yes, I think that we're at a stage, and I suppose particularly after kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, Ireland, Irish society, I suppose itself, began to kind of look at how Ireland is doing in relation to racism and discrimination and what we can do to make it better. And I suppose one of the things I suppose that I find is that with people up there having more discussions, like Eileen Flynn, having more discussions around traveller culture and ethnicity, and you know, but also I suppose people out there, I suppose on an everyday basis, kind of telling their story about kind of what's happening in society. I think people began to see the positives in the community instead of the negatives that they're always shown. And I think that it's important as well that kind of the language around allyship and, how they should, I suppose, respond to incidents and issues that happen within society, but also, I suppose, when it comes to I suppose racism and discrimination within Ireland, we have one of the good things that we have is we have great kind of support with the Minceir community and the Black community in Ireland and other ethnic minorities in Ireland. You know, we stand strong together to fight the racism that's embedded into Irish society. So I think it's important that discussions are happening, and I think that it's important also, I suppose, for people outside of my community and other ethnic communities to have those discussions with their friends and their family and at their dinner table, because that's where a lot of the conversations happen, and a lot of the conversations that are based on myths and stereotypes, you know, that are reinvented and reproduced into society for the next generation, you know, because a lot of these conversations are also happening at home in front of small children that might overhear something, so they might overhear derogatory terms being said about such people, and they go out into the street and they begin to learn that, and it reproduces the racism continuously in society. So that needs to kind of happen on a home basis, where people begin to talk, not to be afraid to talk about racism and how it's happening. Even if you know nothing about it, the first step is to begin to discuss it.
Thanks so much, and I think that's actually a really nice place to kind of wrap up what's been a fascinating story. You've told us not just about your own really amazing rise through academia, education, into kind of prominent position in human rights defence. Is there any kind of last words you'd want to say before we head off, in terms of how we can learn more or support the causes that you're supporting, or maybe learn more about your research?
I suppose first thing I want to say is just thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted, and thank you all to all your attendees as well for coming on and being interested in listening to what's happening here in Ireland. I suppose you can, Sean, you follow me on Twitter, so I suppose you can, and you have my email address, so you'll see a lot of my work going out through that sense. I suppose people can can inquire, I suppose, about the community and look up, I suppose, by looking at not Wikipedia sites, but to look into, in particular, to look into where there's a lot of documents and history documented on the community through the organisations. So if you look at the Irish Traveller website, the Irish Traveller Movement website, Private Point website, National Traveller Women's Forum website, you know, there's a lot of documents there where you'll get a lot of information around the community. But also, I suppose that will lead you on to other smaller local organisations as well, that's all over Ireland, that has also done fantastic and wonderful research and work and reports and studies and surveys and everything else that you want to find information about will be in those. I would advise to not look at the general stereotypes. Like when you type in who we are in Google, you will get nothing but negative stereotypes, that is myths and reproduced racism. And some of those myths and stereotypes, when you look back at it, are myths and stereotypes that were on us since the 1800s, you know. So, and they haven't changed yet. So, you know, just trying to keep an open mind, I suppose, but also to look at, if you're on social media, to follow traveller people, Minceir people, their organisations, and you will be able to, I suppose, see what's happening. Not only, I suppose, around research and stuff, but and history, but and culture, but you will see what's happening, I suppose, through everything else, like music and storytelling and, you know, everything else. So there's a wide range of information out there that can be easily accessible, that is not stereotypical or
That's fantastic, and we'll certainly look that up, and if possible, share some of those websites and information with the attendees. There's been some beautiful comments in the chat as well that you probably haven't had a time to look for, but people kind of offering their support and really inspired by your story, and really happy to learn about the Minceir people from around America and Ireland, and even further afield. So hopefully you get a chance to read some of those comments. And for the rest of the people, I just want to say thank you very much for attending. Thanks to Weiji and the Growing Up in Science crew for putting this on, as well as Dr. Miriam Nyan in the Glucksman Ireland House, and with everybody just to join me in the chat, perhaps, in thanking the wonderful Dr. Sindy Joyce.
Thank you very much from me as well, Dr. Joyce. This was for this very personal and important life story. And for those of you who want to share Dr. Joyce's story, the video recording of this event will be posted on the Growing Up in Science YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.